Stigma, where we talk with leaders from many industries about how mental health and addiction have impacted their lives. Many people suffer silently from mental illness, addiction, depression, anxiety, and trauma. They never seek help because of stigma. In this podcast, host Stephen Hayes and his guests share their stories of recovery in order to encourage others to do the same. Here's Stephen.
Welcome back to another episode of the Stigma Podcast. Today's episode is really special for me. It's someone who's become a friend, someone who's been a mentor to me. Longtime venture capitalist Steve Schlafman joins me today. He's got 5 years of sobriety, and over the last year or so has really become kind of a mentor to me, not so much in investing, even though we have that in common, but more in just this journey of sobriety, of wellness, of trying to find our way. So I'm excited to share this conversation with you. I'm excited to share with you about what his 5 years have looked like, and a blog post that he had written when he was 1 year sober as a VC that he wrote under a pen name. And he's now releasing this blog post under his own name on his 5-year anniversary date, which is today, June 5th, 2020. So without further ado, Steve, thanks for being here, man. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to finally be doing this with you. As you know, I gave you a hard time about not having me on the show sooner.
I know. That's on me. That's definitely a me issue. So, but I'm really grateful that you wanted to do it, and I think your story is going to help a lot of people. I know your story's helped me. So I think a good place to start is with your story. So maybe give a little bio background for the folks that are listening on who is Steve.
Yeah, well, I guess there's a lot of different parts to me. I'm a husband, father. Now I guess I'm a leadership coach. I work with a range of founders and leaders in terms of helping them perform at higher levels. I am also a recovering venture capitalist. I was a professional VC for almost a decade in New York City. And I now am also an angel investor. So I run and manage a small pool of capital where I predominantly invest in a range of pre-seed and seed stage founders and companies. And then I'd say the last thing that I'm usually pretty open about, which is why the reason I'm here, is I'm also sober. And so that's a very big part of my identity, and I'm generally pretty public about it. So that's a little bit about me. There's a lot more to that, but I think that's a good overview.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for saying that openly. I think that really paves the way for others in our industry, in the venture world and the startup world, to be open about their struggles. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, what was it like having a problem with alcohol and being in an industry like venture, and what brought you to get help and get well?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. For me, I would say that the culprit, alcohol definitely played a role in my story, though I would say that the culprit for me was more marijuana and at times Adderall, which I was prescribed to for my ADD. I've had ADD pretty much my whole life, but alcohol definitely played a role. So I think it was like a cocktail of substances. For me, I've always been a pretty high performer in my career. And so like alcohol was one of those things that I tried to do the least amount of, because I felt like if I was completely hungover and felt like shit, I wouldn't be able to get out of bed early the next morning and get to work and perform. And so for me, it was definitely a substance that I relied upon, but I would never necessarily identify as like a full blown alcoholic.
What was that like when you were in your early VC days and you were dealing with the stress of a career, and maybe you were coping with that using marijuana or some other substances? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think back to those days. So technically first got into the business in 2010, which was right as like the sort of the wave of micro VCs was really starting to take off. And I had the good fortune of working for a really awesome firm in New York. I would say that those years were like, no pun intended, extremely intoxicating. Like I loved my work. I was probably, I don't know, I was definitely burning the candle on both ends. I was probably working, like 70, 80 hours a week. And it was just like go, 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 because I was effectively the sort of the principal on the team, which meant like a lot of stuff ultimately stopped with me. And I was oftentimes a big bottleneck. And so I think like because of that crazy work environment and just things flying at me, I used to say that I would come home at the end of every day and smoke. And again, I was like incredibly functional, or at least I thought I was, where, I could smoke a little bit, maybe have a beer or two. And then, because I was taking Adderall for my ADD, be able to work, till midnight, 1, 2 a.m., and then wake up and do it all over again. And like, thinking back to that point in my life, again, it was really formative for my career. And like, I don't look back with any regret whatsoever, but definitely like imposter syndrome played a huge role. And just like not necessarily knowing what I was like, had any clue what I was doing. And I was like really learning on the job. And so like to kind of take that edge off and like quiet my mind at the end of every day was like definitely a part of my ritual. And again, it wasn't like, that period in my life, it wasn't like my wife was, or at the time, my girlfriend, now wife, she was never being like, Steve, like, I think you have a complete like issue, like you're out of control. It was just like, it was something that was like, I sort of locked deep into a box, like inside my soul, where I did a very good job at sort of covering up all my tracks and not necessarily trying to show like a chink in my armor. And so like all the appearances were that I was like highly functioning and had my shit together. But like, in some ways, like I was living, I'll dare say it, but like in some ways I was living like a double life. I wasn't like necessarily doing anything like illegal, but in terms of like using substances to sort of just like take the edge off and numb me, definitely using it a lot more like individually than even like socially at times.
What brought you to the place where you got sober?
I think it was a number of things. So I should back up and say in 2000, it's supposed to have been like 2004, somewhere around there. I was working at Microsoft, and that's when my career was really starting to take off. And I started seeing a therapist, and she was really helpful at the time. Her name was Sheila. I said to Sheila, I was like, telling her about how I think like, I forget exactly, but it was like something like I drank, like I had sort of been mindful of the fact that I like drank 28 days in a row. Now, it doesn't mean I was going on benders. Like I certainly was on some of the weekends, but like after work, I'd go have a pint or two. And, she would start to ask a little bit more. And then I told her that I was smoking every night. And of course, like, I was getting prescribed Adderall from a different doctor. And, she's like, you might want to consider, doing something about this. And so that was really like the first time that kind of the light was shined by someone else. I would say that addiction runs in my family. A lot of my siblings, have it, and I'd say that they absolutely were not bitten by the substance bug, but they also have very addictive personalities and tendencies, whether it's, them going all into like endurance sports or artwork and things like that. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I was aware that it was an issue in my family's history. I was aware that I was using probably more than I should have. And at the time I think I was like 24. So I was like right out of school. I was single, like going out, like the idea of even getting sober was like a stretch. And so, but what happened is I ended up going through, like she had recommended, and I decided to give it a try because I had a very open mind, going through what's known as like intensive outpatient, where and I didn't tell a soul this at the time when I was living at Microsoft or working at Microsoft, where it was like a 28-day program where after work I would go, it was in Kirkland, Washington, right next to Redmond. and I would like go there. And it was like this 28-day program where there would be like a class. And, it's interesting, like thinking back on that experience, also incredibly formative. And I ended up getting 6 months of sobriety. And that there I was introduced to AA, but for a whole range of reasons, it never stuck. I wasn't necessarily like ready to really go all into that. And B, I just, I think this through previous conversations, is that like my spiritual game like wasn't strong enough to get me to really want it. And so I ended up falling off the wagon. I went to Chicago to visit my brother, and went to Wrigley to catch a Cubs game. And next thing I know, I come back to Seattle, and I was out, as they say. That was, then it took me about 10 years to ultimately get to that point where I was like, okay, like I have a problem. I need to get this fixed. In a lot of ways, it wasn't, as I said, I didn't leave like a wake of like carnage. Like my life wasn't in shambles. I didn't have financial problems. Again, on the outside, everything looked great. But like deep down inside, as I said, I think you've heard me say this, Stephen, that I was like a heat-seeking missile. And again, like I think because of my family's history, I was always scared of using like really hardcore drugs or really like going well beyond the line. So like I think a lot of my usage was around this idea of controlling it, and just like controlling it enough where I could be highly functioning, but not so much where I would like, go down like a really dark path into harder substances. So I was always afraid to try harder substances, because I was like, I know that I'm going to absolutely love this. Anyhow, to make a long story short, this was in 2015. So, the show is going to air on my fifth anniversary of getting sober, June 5th, 2015. And I would say that like the months leading up to that, there were just like a variety of things that happened that really caused me to sort of take a look in the mirror. And I think like the pivotal moment for me actually was the summer before. So this was August of 2014. So, there's been almost 10 years between like I went 6 months sober and sort of like white knuckled it, or, like dry drunk, whatever you want to call it, those 6 months in Seattle. 10 years later, career is still on this insane trajectory. I've met an amazing woman, like all these things. But I was just like, again, couldn't kick it. And I would like do everything that I could. And finally, I was on this. I in August of 2014. I go away to France for a wedding. My brother-in-law was getting married, and I stumbled upon in a Kindle store by chance the book The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And I started reading it, and like it just completely knocked me on my ass, as this idea of like living in the past or living in the future, and that it's really that there's the power of just being present unlocks all these amazing things. And what I realized is that, I was always grasping, like as I'm like in Paris and like in the north of France, like reading this book, it just like occurred to me that I was reaching for like all these things outside of me for like validation, for love, for what, a range of things. And that like at the end of the day, it sort of fell on myself, and like that I'm never going to get that if I'm just reaching externally. And I forget exactly what Eckhart Tolle said in the book, but there was a moment where he actually talked about the use of substances to actually numb the present moment, right? And that we reach outward for like material goods and sex and drugs or alcohol and all these things. And in a lot of ways, that takes you out of the present moment. That was like reading that kind of knocked me on my ass, because I said that's when the light bulb went off, where I'm like, I'm literally numbing myself to the point where I'm not aware, I'm not attentive, and I'm just sort of like skating, like I'm floating through life. Again, despite being successful by all measures. And I came home from France and called a friend and said, I want to learn how to meditate. And she said, you're never going to guess this. A friend of mine is actually lives in San Francisco. She's a meditation teacher. She's going to teach you how to meditate. And I said, get out of here. She's like, yeah, I'll put you in touch. She's helping, she's teaching, she's here to teach. She's going to be staying with me. And so I went and I learned transcendental meditation for over the course of 4 days. I sat with this teacher for about 2 hours a day. She basically gave me the technique and my mantra, and I was off and running. And this was really the first time in my life where, and need I remind the audience, like, again, I have ADD, never thought I could sit still, calm my mind, all these things. But, for those of you who don't know what transcendental meditation is, it's effectively a mantra-based meditation where you sit twice a day for 20 minutes. And the whole, the general premise is you are given a mantra in Sanskrit and you just repeat it over and over and over again silently in your head. And then when you find yourself thinking or daydream, whatever it is, you gently bring your attention and focus back to this mantra. And by doing that, it sort of sharpens your faculty and builds attention and awareness and a bunch of other things. And so that for me was an incredible practice because, as I just said, like I was numbing myself and I wasn't really like forcing myself to tune into what was actually really going on and like the content of my thoughts and emotions and perceptions and all these things. And so I basically just picked it up, and because I'm an addict and I'm a type A psychopath, benevolent psychopath, I started meditating twice a day. And whether I was like woke up, and you're supposed to do it in the morning and in the afternoon, so I was doing it when I was hungover, when I was stoned, like regardless, I would just do it. And that practice just shed a light on the way that I actually felt. And it probably was about January or February of 2015. So, about almost 5.5 years ago, where the meditation was really helping me. I was really starting to understand what was going on upstairs. At least I thought I did, right? And I began to think back to when I was at Microsoft and I went through this intensive outpatient program. And I started saying to myself, like, addiction recovery is broken. Like, I went through this program. I paid him $2,500 out of pocket. I didn't want Microsoft's insurance to cover because I was afraid that Microsoft would find out. And at the time, I was right out of school. I didn't have I had like $35,000 of student loans and, all this stuff. And so like, I was just like, I'm going to pay for it out of pocket. And then I just started thinking like there was no customization. I went through the 28 days and I never heard from the facility again. They didn't use technology at all. It was a one size fits all approach to addiction. And I just started like thinking about it. And I'm like, I'm going to start picking up a bunch of books. So I started like reading about addiction. And, this was again, like 5.5 years ago, there were very few startups. Like we tried to map out the space. There was maybe a handful of startups going after addiction and even mental health. Probably there wasn't many at all. And I went to my partners at the firm that I was working at the time, and I said, "Hey, I think there's actually a big opportunity to build an addiction recovery startup. I'd love to hire like an intern this summer and actually do a deep dive with the hope that we either incubate something or invest in it." And, a few of the partners at the time, I think just through their own personal experience, whether it's friends or family, what have you, they were like, this does feel like a big opportunity, like go for it. And so again, there were a bunch of things that were happening where, physically during that period where I was constantly sick. If you ask my wife, I basically was like sick every 2 to 3 months. I had constant sinus infections. I looked like I was punched in the face because I had dark circles under my eyes. I felt like shit. I could feel even though I didn't like ever resort to like hard substances, I could definitely feel it growing stronger and stronger, where I would go to bed and I'd say like, oh, that's it, I'm done. And then sure, the next thing in the morning, I'd be up and like, taking that Adderall. And I was never like a day drinker unless it was like socially like going out with friends. But like for me, it just was like I felt like at that point I was like a heat-seeking missile towards numbing myself. And so there was like health things that started to pop up, and then there was like anxiety and stress because I had been keeping this from my wife because I was really good at covering up my tracks. And I was having like really chronic heartburn and chest pain that was largely due to anxiety, and that I felt like it was like almost like a flywheel where the more the chest pain that I would have would cause, and then I thought like I was dying of cancer. I mean, it was like craziness. But I would lay awake at night, literally like 2-3 a.m. And I don't think I've ever told anybody this outside of the AA room, Stephen, where I'd lay awake at night and honestly be like, I have no one to talk to, right? Like I just want to tell someone what's going on. And I didn't have a therapist at the time. And like, how am I even going to tell my wife this? Like, and all these things. And, I'll go back to us hiring that intern. So she started on a Monday and my partner said, we're going to have someone, start to help the firm. We'd actually like this individual to help this specific project because, he's had his own experiences with addiction and his family and so on and so forth. So we did this 1 week, like deep dive with this woman, Annie Rigger. She's amazing. And she was the one who ultimately was our intern. She was a JD MBA at Harvard, ex McKinsey, real strong focus on healthcare and social justice and impact. She now runs a consulting firm called 17th Edition, which almost exclusively focuses on mental health in the Midwest now. She's incredible. And so she didn't really have exposure to the space. So we all threw ourselves into a conference room for a week. And I was talking to this guy just about his experience and, like what we're seeing in the market. And at the end of the fourth day, this was a Thursday, June 4th, 2015, I pull him aside and I said, hey, I haven't really told many people this, but, I have a problem. And I felt comfortable enough because he had gone sober, 4 or 5 months before off like really severe, opiate addiction where, he was also shockingly highly functioning, like 4.0 college student at one of the top schools in the world. I ended up going to 90 days at one of the top facilities in the world. And this was him like getting back on his feet professionally. And he and I just hit it off. And he said, hey, meet me here at 7:30. And this was at the time I was living in Brooklyn. He wanted me to meet him up in Midtown Manhattan in the basement of this church. And that was that night. That was a Thursday. I went and had a drink with a few buddies. I smoked a little weed. I also like, when I would smoke and drink, I would smoke cigarettes. And I haven't picked up since. And it's been 5 years. And that's really was kind of the story at a high level.
What did it? What happened on that night? What happened that day? What awakening did you have on June 5th, 2015?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was like a one thing, right? It was like, it was years and years of this, like knowing that I had an issue with it, knowing that I was not well mentally and physically, even though from outward appearances. I think I just thought this just popped into my head. I would think back to like I'd go to work and I'd go to the gym, and there would be times where I would smoke before I'd go and get like workouts in. Like that's it. Towards the end, that's what it had become. I was sick. I didn't want to live that way anymore. I had just gotten married. I knew I was eventually going to be a father. I was on, fast track in my career, like really like accelerated path. I just looked at like all of these great things that were happening in my life, yet I felt like shit. And I couldn't live that way anymore. And I think it just got to the point where between learning how to meditate and going inward the previous August to all of those months of like in between, August and June, it just got to the point where I'm like, I don't want to live like this. like being out like on a business trip, going to San Francisco and Montreal, and being out till like 2 or 3 in the morning, and it's just like this just isn't for me anymore.
I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah, like I just like it just came down to like wanting a better life and wanting to feel amazing and wanting to perform and like all these things. And like to me, I think the biggest one is like, even though like, it took probably 4 years after to eventually become a dad, like I want to be an amazing father, right? Like I want to be able to be a role model for my kids. And like, there was no way that I could have brought another human into this world with the condition that I had.
What was that first year of sobriety like for you?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think it was a lot about sort of changing old patterns and habits. Like I had to get rid of not a lot, but I had to, stop hanging out with some friends. Everything that I did was kind of revolved around substances, from like, work events and like going to dinners and meetups, and there'd always be drinks, or, going and watching a sports game, a Pats or Sox game with friends. And inevitably we'd all be smoking or drinking or whatever. And so it was this idea of like really having to change certain things and like just replacing them. Right. So I had to stop hanging out with people. I had to stop going to certain places. What do they say? Like people, places, things like that become triggers. So I think that was a big part of it. I continue to educate myself on sort of the neuroscience behind addiction, because, and so I read pretty much everything I could get my hands on over that year. I started to build largely through AA. And again, as I said earlier, like largely didn't identify as an alcoholic. Went to AA meetings because I loved the accountability and the community. And for me, like I remember in like the first year I took my wife to an AA meeting. It was this meeting at NYU, a Sunday morning spiritual meeting. And it's like, it's an incredible meeting. And it's like just like every walk of life, young, old, black, white, Asian, gay, straight, gender neutral, right? It's just like literally every kind of human being possible goes into that room. And I remember her walking out of that meeting with like tears in her eyes. And she said, every single person could benefit from that. Whether you have an addiction or not, that's so community was a really big part of it. And, frankly, I read this book. It was recommended to me by Holly Whitaker, who runs a company called Tempest. She recently published a book with, I believe with Random House, called Quit Like a Woman. And she's a force. And I had just met her, like literally, like she had maybe had a year of sobriety. I was like 2 months or maybe not even 2 months into it. And she recommended, and she's now like one of my closest friends in the world. And, she recommended a book called Integral Recovery by John Dupuy, who really interesting book. And so, there's a modern philosopher and writer named Ken Wilber, who has basically developed sort of like it's like a mental model of all the mental models is kind of the way to describe it. And it has 4 quadrants. And so basically it's called what he calls the AQAL map, AQAL. And I don't want to bore you with all the details and get in all the nuances, but basically the 4 quadrants are basically like the body, the mind, like social relationships, and sort of like your place in sort of large systems in society, whether it's like the criminal justice system, like, and so like the point is like there's sort of these 4 quadrants, and John Dupuy wrote this book about that, like, that you have to, effectively be balanced in all these 4 quadrants of your life. And it was very, in a lot of ways, counter to the AA model. not that I've gotten a lot of benefit out of both, because for me, my first year of recovery was like a lot of trial and error and seeing what I like. But I love the community aspect of AA and the stories and the connections, but I didn't necessarily like gravitate towards like the big book and the, higher power and all this stuff. But then in the John Dupuy book, I got a lot of like, you need to have a strong physical body. So sleep, nutrition, physical activity, exercise, things of that nature. Then on the relationships and sort of the, kind of the mental, it's like self-expression and like creativity and then, going down to the social quadrant, it's like, relationships, making amends with people, like, doing the right thing, living ethically through relationships. And then like the last quadrant is around like standing in society, like paying your bill, like all these things. I would say that out of the 4 quadrants, I probably had the least work to do in the last one. But the whole point, it was this holistic approach. And I just love that. And so, I think between those two, that book and AA, and it was everything from also like journaling. And, I remember Holly recommended this book called like This May Cause Miracles, which was Gabby Bernstein. I'm rolling my eyes if you see me, because, like I'm not the biggest fan of her work, but like, at least, and all due respect to her, I know there's a lot of people that have gotten a tremendous amount of benefit from, reading and listening to Gabby. And but the point is like she's a big proponent of using affirmations. So like waking up and like saying whatever it is, you got this, or one day at a time, and so I would use affirmation. So I guess what I would say is like the first year was just like a lot of trial and error. I would say the thing that helped me the most is I went to that AA. I should have mentioned this. When I went to that first AA meeting, it was a beginner's meeting, and so there I'm sitting in the room with all these strangers. And they go around and everyone has to basically, and this meeting's amazing, but everyone has to go and give their sobriety date, right? And there I am sitting and I'm with my friend who brought me, and I was like, holy shit. I was like, today's my first day. And, you go and you say your date, date today is, June 5th, 2015. And the whole room like erupts and I feel like an idiot. But like I ended up getting connected to a sponsor that day who was super helpful and just like a mentor of mine. An interesting, like very similar story where highly functioning private equity executive, young, ambitious, very, very similar stories.
How did your wife react to all of this? I mean, she had to wonder where you had gone at 6 a.m. the day that you went to your first meeting, right?
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, in some ways that moment was a blur for me, because I think that was my biggest fear, is like, that stigma of like having to admit someone. Like when I was laying in bed that in those nights where I couldn't sleep because of the anxiety, what I was thinking to myself was, how can my best friend in the world not know that this is what I've been experiencing? And so in that moment when I'm on the couch in my living room and I'm telling my wife, I basically was just like, hey, it's all going to be good. Like, thankfully, I haven't done anything. Like I just came clean, and like, I don't want you to like sit here and judge me right here in this moment. Like there will be time for that, but like, let's just, and she basically said that she'd support me, and it's been, relatively smooth sailing since. Like, the first year was definitely lots of fits and starts. And
what did those fits and starts look like for you?
Yeah, just I think like the cravings that I think anybody gets that is trying to make these lifestyle changes. And so I remember like, I think it was like week 3. I was at a wedding in the woods in Massachusetts, and everyone was getting drunk and high, and, just having to be sober there, and like really feeling like, oh, this absolutely sucks. Like I'm not having fun. I don't really know many people at this wedding. Like normally I'd be like in the center of the dance floor tearing it up, or in the woods or whatever. And so, I think like honestly, that first year was just like me adapting to this new reality and figuring out and I, honestly, I wasn't hard on myself. Like I gave myself permission to eat lots of ice cream, which I still pretty much do every night, right? Like I gave myself permission to be a human and not like take everything away. And so it's just like the first year, a lot of it was just adapting and figuring out how it worked for me. And the other part is like I told, it's not like I started shouting from the rooftops and being publicly about my sobriety. I don't even think I was until like I was close to being 1 year in. But like I did tell some friends, and obviously my wife. And anytime you go out and someone's like, hey, what can I get you to drink? And I'm like, well, I am not drinking. And that sort of brings up a whole host of questions. And at a certain point in time, I just got really comfortable with saying like, I can go to these events, I can go to these work events and not have to drink. And so I would say, interestingly enough, I feel like there was year one was obviously like getting my training, like learning how to ride my bike with training wheels on. Year two was kind of like not too bad. I felt like year two is probably like compared to year one, like much easier. And for some reason for me, year three was like challenging. I think largely because there was that like whole, and there still is that whole like psychedelic bandwagon in terms, I wouldn't even say bandwagon, there's lots of really interesting research coming out about psychedelics. So for me, I started reading like a number of books and listening to talks and just discussing the idea of, psychedelics as a modality of therapy. And so like once I started going down that path, like in terms of just learning about it, inevitably like cravings came up, even though psychedelics tend not to, be, like addictive. And then I'd say like the last few years have been, like I've just settled into this life. And like, I honestly, it's been incredible.
You told me about the first year and some of the experiences you had sharing about this with your wife and living with some of the cravings and the fits and the starts of the early part of the program for you. At the end of that first year, you wrote a blog post, right? What was that all about?
So I wrote a blog post that I ended up publishing under a pen name. And for a variety of reasons, I did publish the post today, and for the first time under my own name. You can read it on my personal blog at SCHLAF.me. But basically the title was this idea of like healing through openness. And I started the blog post by saying our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And it was just my attempt at really coming clean with my story. And, I think there are a variety of people, like I have friends that, have 10, 15 years of sobriety and they're extremely private about it. And I really respect that. But I also believe that as someone that, has somewhat of a following online and that addiction is so prevalent that I have somewhat of a responsibility to at least speak openly about it, because in the post, I think I say something to the effect of like, when we speak openly about our challenges, it gives others the strength to do the same. And the reality is like life is hard and messy and unpredictable for all of us. And we all have people that we love that are struggling with something, whether it's addiction, depression, anxiety, fear, resentment, imposter syndrome. And so like instead of grandstanding on social media, which by the way, I'm the first to be guilty of, like, why not try to embrace some of our imperfections? Because that's how we can start to have a dialogue about what's really going on in our lives.
So why a pen name?
Basically, I did not necessarily want to cause any harm or damage to the firm I was working for. And yeah, there's some sensitivity there. And so I had put so much thought and time into writing that in a lot of ways, I didn't care at the time whether like it was me or just that it was out there.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, and I remember saying to my wife, like, I was like, I ultimately made the call not to publish it, and she said, "Well, who did you write it for?" And I said, "I wrote it for myself," and that was that.
What made you decide now to take that blog post and reprint it in your name?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are a few things. I think first, I wanted to post it about 2 years ago, and I was said, I want to get more time under my belt. Like, there's something about, and maybe I'm making this up in my own head, but there's something about 5 years, right? It feels like a half a decade to me. 5 years feels like I'm now at a point where I'm never going back. I'm now just, this is my life, right? And so that was the first reason. Second reason is, again, like, I have a decent following online, and I think, like, particularly in light of COVID, obviously all the mental health issues that are continue to surface, and I still believe that the discussion of substances in tech has not still been widely discussed. I think there's definitely a mental health discussion that's taking place, and I think there's a lot of people that are leading that discussion, like Emily Analt from COA, and Brad Feld, and Jerry Colonna, and there's a bunch of awesome people that are leading that. But I think very few are shining a light on the role that substances play in our community. And so for me, I felt like, as someone who I think has a responsibility to speak openly about it, in hope that, if one person reads it and is like, that's helpful, because, like, my story, as I said, there was no carnage, right? It was no rock bottom. It was highly functioning. And, I actually believe that, if you think about it, I forget the exact numbers, you might know, but 20 million Americans, something like that, have of some form of addiction.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in the blog post that addiction is an epidemic, and epidemic is a word that we're using a lot these days. So why do you use that word? Like, what makes you describe it that way?
Yeah, I would say that when double digit percentage of the population has, like, struggles from this, it's an epidemic, right? Like, I like to say that, like, this is the sign of an epidemic. If I'm in the middle of, and I'll use this analogy because I'm a Patriots fan, but imagine I'm sitting in the center of Gillette Stadium, 80 plus thousand fans packed the stadium, and I'm sitting at the 50-yard line with a microphone in my hand, and I ask everybody, "Do you know someone that has either died or been adversely impacted by addiction?" Everyone would raise both hands, and to me, that means it's an epidemic. Like, I can't even tell you. In our high, I grew up in a teeny little town north of Boston. Like 3 square miles, 13,000 people, seaside community on the North Shore, like picturesque. No one locks their doors. I had like 5 people in my high school class that have passed from. That's just 5 people in my class, or like in this few surrounding classes that I played sports with. That doesn't include, like, the whole town, right? In the surrounding towns, and everybody kind of knows somebody, right? And so, it's a really big problem. And I guess the point that I was going to make is that, going back to my own story, that I believe that the numbers are actually much bigger than people think, right? And this idea of, like, sober curious, because, like, I think there are just a lot of people that, might not necessarily identify as an alcoholic, like myself. I would go out and I would have more than, like, two drinks or more, like, 5 times a week, right? And by the, like, I guess the book definition, like, I probably had a drinking problem, but I wasn't like a rat. And I actually believe that, like, those that are highly functioning, that are, like, going home and having, like, 2 glasses of wine every night, or, like, smoking every night before they go to bed because they can't sleep. Not saying all those people are addicted, but, like, I would say that there's a bunch of them that are. And so, for someone like myself to speak up about, like, my own story, that, like, again, you can be highly functioning and on the outside appear that everything's great, but inside you just feel like shit.
Well, maybe those people are not chemically addicted, but they might have a way of living that's not sustainable, and they need help with that.
Yeah, and for me, honestly, like I would say that the substances that I use, like technically are not. It's not like I was having withdrawals, right? And like the DTS when I was, like I had it easy on the way out. Relatively speaking, it was by no means was it easy because I had to change lots of ingrained patterns and habits and behaviors. But like, like it was definitely habitual. And so like for me, like as I think about what this has enabled is like I actually believe that, if you think about like I think that alcohol and, largely other substances, like they're fine and like they have a place, but when you start to use them to a point where they become a crutch or they become a habit, and I would say that my belief here is that not drinking, right? That like there's a notion of like when people say, oh, you're sober, like they automatically think I was a train wreck. And I use the word sober because sober effectively means free, like free of substances, right? And so like there's like sobriety is just a term, like whether like I know people that are sober that say they're sober, but they weren't like, they went cold turkey, right? And they just stopped on their own. Not saying that's like the way to do it, but like I guess what I'm trying to say in all this is I believe that sobriety is actually a superpower, and that I feel so much healthier, right? Like my whole life has been transformed to like waking up in the morning and meditating for 30 to 60 minutes almost every day, pretty much every day. Actually having amazing sleep, right? Like when I used to drink and smoke, I wouldn't even dream. I would never like feel like I was getting in like wakeful, like real restful sleep. And now I'm much clear headed. I'm way more patient. I'm way less self centered. Doesn't mean I'm a saint and I'm perfect. I'm far from it. I'm a human being, but like I think that sobriety is a superpower, and that like if you can change certain aspects of your life to accommodate this decision to live substance free, it's incredible. Like I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And I would say like out of all the accomplishments in my life, aside from being a father and a husband, like loving father and husband, like I would say sobriety is like the number one thing I'm most proud of.
Your perspective on sobriety today is very clear. I love the way you talk about it. And what I want to wrap up with here is in your blog post, you wrote that living a sober life would be impossible. And I wanted you to kind of compare and contrast your perception of what sobriety would be like in the days before you finally pursued it and how you just described it now.
Yeah. I think it's just this idea of like coming home at the end of the day and not being able to like take my edge off, or not being able to hang out with certain friends, or not being able to go frequent certain venues that I just used to love to go to and like sit at the bar and, have a drink and shoot the shit with the bartender who I became friends with. Like, or like going to a Patriots game at Gillette with my friends and not being able to go and like tailgate and quiet. So it was like all of it, or like go travel and have a glass of wine because I actually enjoyed like going out and having a good meal with my wife. And so it was like all of these things, like going to events, like work events, and not being able they're like, and so they were like just this idea of like that so much was geared around like substances. And like, I think one of the things we fail to realize is that like they're everywhere, right? Like walk down the street in New York City and it's like there's a bar or a liquor store on like every other block. And so, yeah, it was just that was the toughest part for me, was like knowing that I was going to have to like say goodbye to a lot of things and basically reprogram the way my brain worked.
Yeah. When I was going into sobriety, I knew that I was going to finally get help. I was having these thoughts of, man, I'll never have fun again. Like I'll never do anything that I enjoy again because everything was centered around alcohol. So I was going to have to reprogram my entire life.
Yeah, and that's honestly what I ended up doing. As I said, I'm glad that I did, and it's taken hundreds and hundreds of hours of whether it's exercise or sleep or meditation, my coaching like training to become a coach, and mentoring other guys and girls. And it's been, I'd say, maybe thousands of hours of an investment over the last, even 6 years when I around the time before I got sober and decided down this path. And, honestly, I'm just so grateful.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, really to wrap up with, is I want to ask you, where does somebody go to get help right now? How does someone get sober? How does someone get clean? How does someone get well? But I really want you to frame this around our industry. How do you do it? How do you deal with the pressure and the stress? And how do you find the time? And how do you deal with the perception and the stigma? Like, how do you navigate finding your way to sobriety, specifically coming from the startup ecosystem?
It's so personal. This idea of deciding to at least consider it, right? Like, I would say that first of all, you can always reach out to me, and I mean that sincerely. I have an amazing network of sober friends and people that have decided to live this way, and we're all in it to help each other. And so the first thing is, feel free to reach out. Second is, I think, like, finding, if you have a friend or someone in your life that has gone through it, I think always having that conversation. A lot of friends that I know that have got sober, like, started that way, where they initially were like, I think I might be struggling with this, or I might want to, like, stop doing this. Could you help me? Like, what did you do? So I would say, like, if you know someone that has, like, reach out to them. And what I think, like, you'll find is that those that have been through it, like, are actually a lot more understanding and open than you probably think. Certainly those that have gone down the path. And then I think there are a bunch of other really great resources, and again, it depends on your level of comfort. I know that, there's what's known, certainly in New York, what's known as intergroup, where, there's like, it's like a hotline you can call where they can tell you where to go to a meeting. There's just tremendous amount of resources online. It can be confusing to navigate. And so, for me, I really recommend this book, Integral Recovery. I think it's phenomenal. I think another great place to start is journaling and just seeing what comes up, right? And even meditation, and just, like, starting to just tune into your so the point is, Stephen, is that there's a range of ways to sort of open it up, and I think it all depends on the person's level of comfort and, ultimately what their objective is. I recommend Holly's book, Quit Like a Woman, even though the name suggests that it's for women, and she predominantly wrote it for women and people of color, sort of marginalized communities. It's incredibly good, and, like, I think she very much takes a holistic approach. So, like, I'm sort of rambling now, but I think there are a bunch of really great resources. But listen, like, if you're out there, you're struggling, or you just have questions, always reach out, and I'd be happy to at least point you in the right direction.
How is your life different now in sobriety?
I ended up quitting my job at, a very lucrative job where, I would have been able to probably retire at a very, very young age, decided to become a coach and be able to work with founders and other leaders and executives to ultimately help them bring their vision to life and evolve into great leaders. And so, for me, like, as sponsorship in AA is all about service and, like, being of service to other people. And so for me, even though I do still invest through my own fund, I basically spend half my time investing, and predominantly as an angel, and half my time as a coach. And my plan is to eventually blend these two worlds together in a more formal way. But I think what I'm trying to get at is, like, this is a predominantly service, right? Like, I'm doing this not because I want to go and make millions and millions of dollars, like, particularly on the coaching side. I'm doing it because, like, I want to drive outcomes, right? Like, I want to help people. I want to help founders achieve their dreams. And to me, I think that's an awesome calling. And, the best part about being a coach also is that, like, my skill set is broad. Like, I could sit down with someone that might not be in the startup ecosystem and but can like help them sort of think through a number of things, like, what they want to do with their career, what are their values, how do they deal with certain situations. And so it's a long way of saying, like, the next 10 years of my life is largely dedicated towards helping and serving others. And like, I absolutely would not have gone there if it weren't for this program. I'd say the other thing is my spiritual practice is, 10 years ago when I decided to go get sober back in Seattle, like, I did not have any spiritual practice. Now I have a very, very specific meditation practice every morning. I work with a Buddhist teacher once a week. I think right now, especially because we're in like post-COVID, I would say all of my reading is pretty much based on spirituality or leadership, but I'd say like a lot of it's grounded in spirituality, specifically Buddhist philosophy. And so like that's also changed. And then, obviously I'm now a father. And, I think between meditation and being healthy and being of service to other people, certainly being of service to my family and my daughter, I'm way more aware and present. Like, when I sit down and do my meditation every morning, I go through like a series of checks. And the first one is like, why am I doing this? Like, what's my mission here? And I always say that like my mission with meditation, right? And it's not like is to create awareness and attention. And if I can live like in service of other people and doing it where I'm aware and attentive, I think that like in a lot of ways is like the purpose of life.
Well, look, man, this has been awesome. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for doing it openly in front of the startup ecosystem, or doing it publicly, if you will, so that people can be encouraged to share their own. People can be encouraged to get help, and that they know there's one more person out there they could reach out to when they're ready.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I'll end with this: is that for me, I thought like, and you had said like I thought it was going to be very hard and impossible, and my life has never been better. And I don't want to say this for sure, but I'm confident that for those listening that are struggling, that if you try to make an effort, and that you put your energy behind it, and it's something that you really want, like deep down inside, there are enough tools and communities out there where you'll at least take a first step and see what it's like. And for me, it took almost 20 years to finally crack it. So it's sort of just taking it one day at a time and not being too hard on yourself, and just knowing that I try to just say, like, it's one of my mantras on my meditations is just simple and easy, just kind of take it one day at a time.
Well, look, man, thank you for doing this. It's really a joy to have you. You've been really helpful to me in my recovery. I know when we first spoke, it was early on in my recovery, and I remember just kind of being floored that some other VC was on the same path, but several years ahead of me. And it was really helpful to me to know that.
None of us are alone. That's the thing that I think is, for me is like, once I started to like get into this community, I realized that it's much bigger than we think. It's a little bit of a, like a shadow network of sorts. It's a badge of honor for me.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. And I think this is going to help. There's going to be some folks in our community that hear this, and I think it's going to help them. I think you're probably going to hear from a bunch of people. So get ready for it.
Great. Well, I can't wait till it comes out.
I just want to say another special thank you to Steve for being here. I want to say thank you to our listeners for being here. Without you, there would be no show. There'd be no one to interact with. And so we're grateful to have you. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to have you interact with us on social media, on Twitter at StigmaCast, on Instagram at Stigma Podcast. And we've recently created a Patreon page where if you want to follow us closely, if you want to support us, if you want deeper insights into the episodes, into the market updates, etc., those insights will be posted on our Patreon page, which is linked in the show notes. It's also on our homepage. And with that, I just want to say thank you again for being here. Until next time, stay safe and be well.